All right. Hello, friends. Welcome to Read Aloud. So, yesterday I had asked you to describe Edward, both on the inside and on the outside. And lots of friends got that on the outside. He wears very fancy clothes and he has very fancy shoes. And he's got lots of really nice things that he's been given by Abilene. And on the inside, I had lots of different responses from friends. So, I had some friends who said he was really kind and caring. And then I had other friends who responded and said that they thought he was a little bit braggy and maybe kind of selfish. So I want to reread you some parts from yesterday, and I want you to really be thinking, what kind of a character is Edward on the inside? Because not all of our main characters are kind and caring. So listen to these few things and be thinking, okay, what does this tell me about how Edward is on the inside? Edward thinks highly of himself. Someone thinks highly of themselves, they think that they are like really special. Edward is amazed at how fine he is. Edward liked to look at his own reflection in the window. And Edward was not interested in what people had to say. So that makes me think all those little pieces that were in our story yesterday make me think that maybe he isn't really kind and caring, that maybe he's only really worried about Edward, that someone said he's a little bit conceited. So maybe he just thinks only about himself and he's a little bit selfish and a little bit braggy. So I want you to be thinking about that again today as we read our second chapter and think to yourself, okay, is that still true? Do we still think Edward is maybe not so kind? And that he's a little bit selfish and he's a little bit only thinking about himself? Today also, while we're reading, you're going to have two things that happen to Edward. And I want you to be thinking about, one, how do these characters treat Edward, the other characters? And two, how does that make Edward feel? So here we go, chapter 2. We see at the beginning of chapter 2 that we've got this picture of this little girl who's hugging Edward, and I'm wondering, maybe that could be Abilene. All right. Edward's days passed, one into another, and nothing remarkable happened. Oh, there was the occasional small drama. Once Abilene was at school, and the neighbor's dog, a boxer named Rosie, came into the house, uninvited and unannounced, and lifted its leg on the dining room table, spraying the white tablecloth with urine. Then he trotted over and sniffed Edward, and before Edward even had time to consider he was being sniffed by a dog, he was in Rosie's mouth, and Rosie was shaking him back and forth, growling and drooling. So we know that Edward has these really fancy clothes. How do we think he's going to feel when he's in this mouth of this big drooling dog? Fortunately, Abilene's mother walked past the dining room and saw Edward suffering. "Drop it!" she shouted at Rosie, and Rosie, surprised into obedience, did as he was told. Edward's silk suit was stained with drool. His head ached for several days afterwards, but his ego had suffered the most damage. Abilene's mother had referred as him as it, and she was more outraged that the dog had urinated on the tablecloth than the shame that Edward had suffered at the jaws of Rosie. All right, let's stop and think here. Edward is saying that the biggest damage that he suffered, the biggest thing that hurt his feelings, was that his ego had suffered. He had been called it. So ego is really what someone thinks about themselves. So he thinks that his ego, if I have a big ego, I think really highly of myself. His ego had suffered because he had been called it. So what does that tell us about him? Okay, let's keep reading. And then there was another time where a maid who was new to the house, was eager to impress her employers, came upon Edward sitting in his chair in the dining room. "What is this bunny doing here?" she said out loud. Edward did not care to be called the word bunny. He found it mean and extreme. The maid bent over and looked into his eyes. "Humph," she said, and she stood back up. She put her hands on her hips. "I reckon you're just like every other thing in this house, something that needs to be cleaned and dusted." And so the maid vacuumed Edward Tulane. She sucked each of his long ears into the vacuum clean hose. She pawed at his clothes and beat his little tail. She dusted his face. And in her zeal to clean, she vacuumed Edward's gold pocket watch right off of his lap. The watch went into the vacuum cleaner with a clank, and the maid did not even seem to hear. When she was done, she put the dining room chair back at the table, and not sure about where Edward actually belonged, she finally decided to shove him among the dolls in the shelf in Abilie's bedroom. "That's right," said the maid. "There you go." She left Edward on the shelf in the most awkward and uncomfortable position. His nose was actually touching his knees, and he waited there, with the dolls, like a flock of unfriendly birds, until Aibileen came home from school and found him missing and ran from room to room calling his name. "Edward!" she shouted. "Edward!" There was no way, of course, for her to let him know where he was. No way for him to answer her. He could only sit and wait. When Aibileen found him, she held him close, so close that Edward could feel her heart beating, was leaping almost out of her chest. "Edward," she said, "oh, Edward, I love you, and I never want you to be away from me." So I'm thinking here we definitely know how Aibileen feels about Edward. All right, back to our story. The rabbit, too, was experiencing great emotion, but it was not love. It was annoyance that he had been so bothered, that he had been handled by the maid as a simple object, almost like a bowl or a teapot. The only satisfaction to be had from the whole affair was that the new maid was fired immediately. So here Edward's saying that he's happy that the maid got fired. Edward's pocket watch was located later, deep within the vacuum cleaner, dented, but still in working condition. It was returned to him by Aibileen's father, who presented it with a mocking bow, which means he was almost making fun of him. "Sir Edward," said her father, "your timepiece, I believe." The dog affair and the vacuum cleaner incident, those were the great dramas of Edward's life, until the night of Aibileen's 11th birthday, when, at the dinner table, a cake was being served and a ship was mentioned. All right, my dears. So now that we've finished our second chapter, I want us to be thinking about how did the maid and how did Aibileen's mother treat Edward, and how did that make Edward feel? How is he feeling about both of these two main events? So what I would like you to do today is that I want you to use details and evidence from your book, so be thinking about what happened in the story that makes you think this way, to answer those two questions. How did they treat him, and how does it make Edward feel? Can't wait to see what you respond.